An old woman in a quiet forest thinks she's alone, but when intruders plan to rob her, they meet her fierce protector, Charlie, a powerful wolf. What happens next is a battle of survival and loyalty you won't believe. Stay tuned to see how the story unfolds, and let me know where you're watching from. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Crestwood, nestled deep in the woods of the American South. The sun was just setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. The air was still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind gently passed through the trees. It seemed like any other peaceful evening, but for one old woman named Clara, it was a day she would never forget. Clara had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. Her house was modest, tucked away at the edge of the forest. She didn't need much to be happy. In fact, her small cabin felt more like home than any mansion ever could. The scent of freshly baked bread often filled the air, and the crackle of her fireplace was the soundtrack to her life. Despite her solitude, Clara always felt at peace. She was strong, independent, and never once felt lonely. But that evening, as Clara walked down the narrow path leading back to her cabin, something didn't feel right. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the stillness in the air was unsettling. It was the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. A faint noise broke through the silence. The sound of footsteps. They were light at first, almost unnoticeable, but gradually they grew louder. Clara's heart started to race. She looked around but saw no one. Yet the sound persisted, as if someone or something was watching her. She quickly glanced behind her. That's when she saw them. 3 shadowy figures standing at the edge of the trees, their faces hidden by the fading light. Clara's instincts kicked in. She wasn't the kind of woman who would just stand there and wait for trouble. She had survived on her own for years, and no one was going to threaten her now. What Clara didn't know was that these figures weren't just any strangers. They were escaped prisoners, men who had spent years behind bars for violent crimes, and now they were free, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. They had heard rumors about an old woman who lived alone in the woods, rumored to be wealthy. They thought it would be an easy mark. After all, an elderly woman living alone in the middle of nowhere. She'd be an easy target. But what they didn't know was that Clara wasn't the helpless woman they had imagined. The prisoners, hungry and desperate, had been tracking Clara for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity. They thought it would be easy to rob her, maybe scare her a little, take what they wanted, and disappear into the night. But as they crept closer to the cabin, they didn't realize they were walking straight into the jaws of danger. Clara had a secret. It wasn't something she flaunted, and it wasn't something she needed to advertise. But over the years, she had made an unlikely friend, a creature as wild and untamed as the forest itself. His name was Shadow, and he had been with Clara for almost as long as she had lived in the cabin. Shadow wasn't your average dog or even a large house pet. He was a wolf, a majestic, powerful animal who had once been a lost cub. Clara had found him in the forest, wounded and alone, just like herself. She had nursed him back to health, and in return, Shadow had become her protector. Now, as Clara stood in the clearing, with the prisoners drawing closer, Shadow was only a few steps behind her, hidden in the darkness. He had been watching from the shadows, waiting for his moment. The prisoners had no idea what they were walking into. They didn't know that Clara wasn't as defenseless as they thought, and they certainly didn't know that Shadow, with his sharp senses and fierce loyalty, was ready to defend her at any cost. What they didn't realize was that they were about to make a grave mistake, a mistake that would lead them to face something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. As the men made their way toward Clara's cabin, one of them spoke up. "Let's just grab whatever we can find. We'll be in and out, no problem." But little did they know, this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. What they thought would be a quick robbery was about to turn into something far darker. Shadow's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light as he moved silently toward them, every step calculated, every muscle ready for the attack. The prisoners didn't stand a chance. The first one to step forward barely had time to blink before Shadow lunged, his teeth bared, his growl shaking the very air around them. The men froze, their eyes widening in horror. They had no idea what they were up against. And Clara, she stood there, calm as ever, knowing exactly what was about to unfold. The first man was on the ground. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't move a muscle. She knew Shadow had it under control. He was her protector, her companion, and he never failed her. The prisoners, however, were in complete shock. They hadn't anticipated anything like this. Their faces drained of color as they looked at the massive wolf snarling over the fallen man, his sharp teeth glistening in the moonlight. "Get back!" one of the prisoners shouted, but his voice was shaky, filled with fear. Shadow stood over the man, growling low and menacingly. The prisoners took a hesitant step back, but they were trapped. They hadn't realized how far they had wandered into the forest, how isolated they were from help. Clara's cabin was surrounded by thick woods, and there was no escape in sight. Clara's voice was calm, even a little too calm for the situation. "I suggest you leave. Now." The second prisoner, the biggest of the three, swallowed hard. He pulled a knife from his belt, though it was clear he was only doing it out of fear. He had no real plan. "Stay back. We'll hurt the wolf," he stammered. Clara didn't even flinch. "You can try," she said, her voice colder now, but still steady. With a swift movement, Shadow leapt back into the shadows, his body a blur as he circled the men, keeping them in his sights. The prisoners' panic grew. They had underestimated this quiet old woman and the animal that had become her guardian. This wasn't a situation they could control. Clara knew exactly what they were thinking. They were desperate. They were hungry. They needed money. But desperation could lead people to do foolish things. She had seen it before. "Listen to me," the third prisoner said, his voice shaking. He was younger than the others, and his hands were trembling as he clutched a crowbar. "We don't want to hurt anyone. We just need something to get by, that's all." Clara stepped forward slowly, her eyes unwavering. "It's not too late for you to leave. Walk away, and you'll make it out of here without harm." But the prisoner with the crowbar shook his head, his face contorted with frustration. "No, you don't get it. We're not leaving without something." His eyes darted nervously around, knowing the situation was slipping out of his control. He was trying to keep his composure, but it was clear he was terrified. Shadow was already behind him. The wolf's low growl filled the air, and for the first time, the prisoner turned around, realizing just how close the danger was. His breath caught in his throat. There was nowhere to run. There was no escape. The fear was real now, sinking into their bones. Clara didn't give them another chance to react. "Leave. Now," she repeated, her voice firm and unyielding. For a moment, the three prisoners stood frozen, locked in place by their fear. The moonlight illuminated Clara, standing calmly in front of her cabin, with Shadow by her side. An imposing figure, his eyes glowing with quiet menace. The prisoners were no longer looking at her as the frail old woman they thought she was. They saw her for who she truly was, a woman not to be trifled with. One of the prisoners began to back away slowly, inching toward the trees. The others followed, their hands still clenched around their weapons, but it was too late. Shadow was already moving, his body sleek and fast as he darted between the men, blocking their retreat. The prisoners scrambled in panic, their eyes wide with terror, but they had nowhere to go. The forest surrounded them on all sides. And then, the sound of a deep, menacing growl filled the air once more. "Do you want to try your luck?" Clara's voice rang out stronger now. She wasn't asking them to leave anymore. She was commanding it. The prisoners stood frozen in place, their minds racing. They could feel the weight of their decision sinking in. No amount of money was worth facing the beast standing between them and freedom. They had no choice but to retreat. Slowly, they turned and ran into the night, their footsteps echoing through the trees. Shadow watched them go, his body tense. But Clara knew he wasn't just guarding her from these men. He was guarding her from all the fear and loneliness she had endured over the years. He had become her family, her protector, her friend. The prisoners didn't make it far. They had no idea how dangerous the forest could be after dark. And with Shadow's watchful eyes following them, they knew they wouldn't be able to escape easily. Clara waited until they were out of sight, then turned back to the warmth of her cabin. She didn't need to say anything to Shadow. He had done what he was born to do, just as she had done what she had always done, survived. The two of them, in their quiet corner of the world, were a force to be reckoned with. From that night forward, no one dared to challenge Clara or Shadow again, and the legend of the old woman and her wolf spread far and wide, reminding everyone that appearances can be deceiving, and the strongest bonds are often the ones we least expect. Clara and Shadow lived out the rest of their years in peace, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Together, they had shown that no matter how alone you might feel, there is always strength in unexpected places. And sometimes the fiercest protectors come in the form of a wolf and the woman who loved him.